I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. Last week we talked about The Black Cat, a 1934 Universal movie starring Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, and I noted that there were images in that movie, specifically a collection of dead women preserved and suspended in glass cases, which brought to mind a much more modern movie. Well, that movie is The Cell from 2000, the directorial debut of Tarsem Singh, which I guess a lot of people will remember as that weird Jennifer Lopez serial killer movie. And the film certainly is divisive, and Tarsem's bold approach straight out of the gate proves enough fuel, I think, for both sides of the argument. Pretentious and hollow, or visionary and arresting. For the record, I fall more into the latter camp. I don't think The Cell is by any stretch a masterpiece, but I do think Tarsem's next film, The Fall, is a masterpiece, but we're not here to talk about The Fall, we're here to talk about The Cell. Okay, so I think the synopsis for The Cell acts as a kind of litmus test for the movie. If you scoff at it, then the film probably isn't for you. If you lean in a little bit more and say, tell me more, then that's exactly what I intend to do. The FBI is tracking a serial killer who holds his victims captive in a glass cell for a couple of days, which slowly fills with water. They find him too late. He's fallen into a coma, and the clock is ticking for them to find out where he imprisons his victims so that they can rescue the last lady he captured before she dies. So far, so standard. In order to locate this last victim, FBI agent Vince Vaughn enlists the help of social worker Jennifer Lopez to use experimental psychotherapy technology to enter the mind of the comatose killer and engage with him in the landscape of his own twisted imagination. It's just your run-of-the-mill Silence of the Lambs meets Dreamscape type movie. Oh, and Vincent D'Onofrio is the serial killer. There's no getting away from the fact that the script is heavily influenced by Silence of the Lambs, and presumably heavily influenced by the commercial success and awards success of Silence of the Lambs. It's like someone watched Silence of the Lambs and a light bulb went off when Scott Glenn says to Jodie Foster,
Believe me, you don't want Hannibal Lecter inside your head.
dude, what if Hannibal Lecter was literally inside your head? And in lesser hands, that sci-fi twist on an FBI procedural would have brought us another virtuosity. Do you remember that film where Denzel Washington is a cop trying to catch Russell Crowe, who is a virtual reality AI amalgamation of the worst serial killers throughout history? Thankfully, The Cell is not that. Instead, the admittedly preposterous premise acts as a diving board from which Tarsem leaps into a completely new visual language to tell a tired old catch the killer story. Before we dive into the dreamscape elements of The Cell, there is a significant chunk of the story, specifically at the front end, which is set in the real world and concerns the FBI investigation and the killer's modus operandi. It is worth noting that what Starger, the killer, does to these women, what he puts them through before death and how he uses them after death, is truly disturbing. Make no mistake, parts of The Cell are hard to watch. There is a strong element of misogyny that runs through the film, but let me be clear, while The Cell depicts acts of misogyny, brutal acts, I do not believe the story, the film as a whole, or the filmmakers are misogynists. I do get the feeling that there was perhaps an impulse to go further than Silence of the Lambs, more extreme, and I'll be honest though, I think what the real world killer does, they could have perhaps reined that aspect in, been a little bit more subdued, a little less out there. It would have made much more of a counterpoint between the mundanity of real world evil, how he is in our world versus the empiric sort of godlike view Starger has of himself in his own dreamscape. I've got to admit though, this real world sort of first act does have an innate sense of urgency about it, and it works. Yes, of course, it's Thomas Harris Light. It's a super condensed remix of Manhunter, but seeing as Manhunter is easily one of my top 5 films of all time, you know, I'm sitting in this bar, I'm sipping on a beer, and I'm thinking, do you know what, this covers band is pretty good. Howard Shore's score helps. In fact, I'd say it's the secret weapon of the movie. Shore is a long-time collaborator with David Cronenberg and is a proven master at turning in music which communicates a kind of doomy, tragic fatalism to events that make the personal feel grandly epic. But just as Tarsem lets fly with the visual palette once we enter the dreamscape, Shore too brings us different flavours and musical cues once we enter that realm. Exotic, magisterial, awesome in the truest sense of the word, to cause feelings of fear and awe. I honestly think it's one of his best scores, but if Tarsem found a great collaborator in Howard Shore, I think he found a soulmate in costume designer Eiko Ishioka. Ishioka won a deserved Academy Award for Best Costume Designer for her work on Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's why you might see a similarity between Vlad's muscle armour in the prologue of Bram Stoker's Dracula and the suspension suits that the carers and the patients have to wear in order to merge consciousnesses in the cell. But elsewhere in the film, real-world restrictions are cast aside. Now, I know in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the costumes that she designed are wonderfully elaborate, but they also kind of, sort of, even in a fantastic realism that this movie is set in, have to work in the real world. For example, in Castle Dracula, Old Man Dracula's sort of Chinese dressing gown, smoking jacket type affair with his enormous long red train. I think that's about as long as you could possibly push it while still maintaining some notion that that costume might work in the real world. The costumes within Starger's subconscious in the cell, however, need to adhere to no such notions of functionality. Room-sized capes, hair twisted into horns, crocodile skin, scaly wing capes, exotic slave collars and face masks. Eiko Ishioka and Tarsem Singh are a perfect fit, and she continued to work with him on The Fall, his bona fide masterpiece, Immortals and Mirror Mirror, for which she received a posthumous Academy Award nomination, again for Best Costume Design. I remember seeing The Cell in theatres in 2000 when it came out, and the moments when we enter Starger's head, my heart started racing. I was holding my breath. Now, upon rewatching 19 years later, I'll admit that some of its power is diminished. I think that's only down to the fact that in the intervening years, other filmmakers have gone down that sort of visual path that Tarsem forged in The Cell. I don't want to suggest that these sections have lost all of their power, because I don't think that that's true. But perhaps what was astonishing to me in the year 2000 is slightly less so now. For one thing, I've seen the film a few times. I'm expecting it, and I acknowledge that that's inherently unfair to an almost 20-year-old movie which set a new visual language for serial killer films. Some of these scenes, it's been well documented, are based on the work of late 20th century artists. You have Dawn by Odd Nerdrum, Shacked, if I'm pronouncing that right, by H.R. Giger, a stop-motion animation Street of Crocodiles by the Brothers Key, and of course Damien Hirst's Some Comfort Gained from the Acceptance of the Inherent Lies in Everything. And it sure as heck draws inspiration from the music videos of Marilyn Manson and Nine Inch Nails. There is no distinction drawn between so-called high and low art in The Cell. I genuinely believe this film began the kind of visual interrogation of the dark aesthetic beauty within the mind of, for want of a better word, evil. That Damien Hirst piece is also directly referenced in Brian Fuller's TV series Hannibal. And for me, the Thomas Harris connection doesn't end there. I admittedly struggled with Thomas Harris's book Hannibal, which was much more out there than Red Dragon or Silence of the Lambs. The Cell lives in the same kind of mind palace space of Hannibal Lecter from Thomas Harris's third Lecter novel. And that linking of extreme violence and high art is explored a little in Ridley Scott's film adaptation of Hannibal, and finds real expression in Bryan Fuller's Hannibal TV series, where the real world is drab and oppressive in opposition to the beauty and transformative liberation of the madman serial killer's art and internal life. On the DVD commentary, Tarsem says of D'Onofrio, he understood when I said this is not a movie about a serial killer, this is an opera. And he also said the thing about this film is it's an opera, and there is no such thing as a subtle opera. Taken in that heightened sense, The Cell actually gives me a way into Harris's novel Hannibal. I can accept the mind palace stuff and all the outrageously operatic revenge plan of Mason Verger, and the short section where Jennifer Lopez's mind is completely subsumed by that of Starga even points a way towards me accepting the culmination of the novel Hannibal and what happens to Clarice Starling. The cast is a strange thing indeed. Having Jennifer Lopez and Vince Vaughn in lead roles really does date the movie. I suspect it was a project which would not have got off the ground without a name attached to it, and in 2000, no denying Jennifer Lopez was a name. But Vince Vaughn's inclusion always struck me, even in 2000, as a little bit like stunt casting to me. Either that or it screamed of an actor who was desperate to get out of his particular pigeonhole. Both are, don't get me wrong, entirely adequate in their parts. They don't prevent the suspension of disbelief. But this is the Vincent D'Onofrio show. He gets to play as the killer, the broken man, the frightened boy, the imaginary demigod in the mind of Starga. There is no way that he could have gone too broad in a film and a role like this, and I find it fascinating that he can be so large at times and yet still retain our empathy when required and inspire fear when needed. If you can't get past Jennifer Lopez or Vince Vaughn, then I understand that. If you find the story to be a whole load of regurgitated stuff from other books and movies, I really can't argue the case against that. If you think that The Cell is pretentious and far too pleased with itself about how artsy it's being, you may have a point. Personally though, I think that every once in a while a film comes along which completely rearranges what we think of Catch the Killer and serial killer movies. Films like Peeping Tom and Psycho, Profondo Rosso from Dario Argento, Seven, and yes, Silence of the Lambs. Personally, I feel that The Cell belongs in this esteemed company.